are very, very happy that you were able to join us. This is an incredible opportunity and an incredible time for us who live here in the United States to have with us our guest speaker, Aviva Chomsky. I will introduce her in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to tell you that this month, actually October, our organization has 30 years of activism. And we are very proud. The name is Howard County Friends of Latin America, and the reason for that name is because those of us who started this organization 30 years ago mostly lived in the Howard County area. But it's very interesting because Howard County Friends of Latin America started as Howard County Friends of Central America. And the reason why our group was started by 5 members, some of them are not with us anymore, but we are continuing with the work. And the reason why we started is because we were very concerned about the policies of the US government towards Central America at the time. And we started as Howard County Friends of Central America. In the 1990s, with the overthrow of Aristide in Haiti, and with the horrible position of the United States towards Cuba, which basically felt that when the Soviet bloc went under, that they were basically going to push their embargo, their blockade against Cuba, we decided to include Cuba and Haiti in our work, in our solidarity work, and we became Howard County Friends of Central America and the Caribbean. And a few years later, with the conflicts in Colombia in particular, we decided to change our name to Howard County Friends of Latin America. So that's how our work has evolved. We are a very small organization of folks, primarily, most folks are from the US, not Latin Americans. Some of us are Latin Americans, but not all of us. You don't have to speak Spanish. You can join us. All you need to do is care to make our relations better. We want the world with peace. We want policies of the US government that not only benefit the working people of Latin America, but also the working people right here in the United States. And we believe that what we provide is alternative information, because the information that many times the US government, the press provides here in the US does not provide sufficient information for you to make a choice, for you to be informed and decide what is right and what is wrong. Because so long as you are only fed lies, you don't have a choice. And there is no freedom of expression if that is the situation. And that is what I believe happens here in the United States with many issues, especially with issues like war, where the US and the big corporations that produce arms, that sell to both sides, are benefiting from that sale of weapons all over the world. So Latin Americans are not an exception, and the suffering. There are many people around the world, and discrimination and racism many times comes out of that. So it's important for those of us who live so close to Washington to be involved and not to let them decide for us. We have to use our voices. So thank you for coming. Please make sure that you take this little pink brochure that talks about our group, and you can sign up so that you can get information from us. Please also take a flyer in the back. We have our upcoming event, November the 19th. It's going to be a celebration again of 30 years. We're going to do it with music from the Andean mountains in South America with a group of Bolivians. It's beautiful music. And we are going to do a recount of what work we have done in the last 30 years, showing you what causes we have worked on. We, as a very small organization, basically react to what the US does in other parts of the world, because we don't have the power to set the agenda, as you can imagine. So tonight, I want to give special thanks to, of course, all of our volunteers who make this possible. And I want to mention Jose Luis Gutierrez, and the main reason he is a member of our group was from Puerto Rico. Jose Luis is in the back. And the reason why I say that is because 2 years ago, I heard Aviva being interviewed in Democracy Now! On her newly published book then on immigration. And I thought, oh my God, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could invite her to our community? And Jose Luis was at that meeting and he volunteered to contact Aviva. And to me it was almost like a dream. I thought, oh my gosh, that's almost impossible. Boston, we are down here in Maryland. But Jose Luis started that and we followed up a year later, and 2 years later, Aviva is here. So thank you, Aviva, for accepting our invitation. So please, I want to introduce you to Aviva. Aviva is an immigrant rights activist. She's a professor of history and coordinator of Latin American studies at Salem State University. And she's going to talk tonight about the book, and her recent book, 2 years old actually, Undocumented How Immigration Became Illegal. Very quickly, the overview of how this is going to be run. Aviva is going to talk for about 30-40 minutes. After that, we are going to open the floor to questions and answers for another 20 to 30 minutes. And then we are going to leave enough time for you, if you haven't bought her book, to buy her book. It's incredibly important that we understand the history of immigration as she will speak. So I hope you buy it, we have it available, and then she will be signing it at the end of the program. We need to be out of this place by 9:30. So thank you so much for coming, Aviva.
So I'm going to talk really fast. First of all, thank you so much, Leslie, for the lovely introduction. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for persisting, because sometimes there's days when I get like 100 emails and I kind of scan through them and think, okay, what do I have to deal with right now? And then whatever doesn't get dealt with right now kind of gets forgotten about because the next day I get another 100. So I think it took some persistence on your part, but I appreciate that. I'm really excited to be here. And thank you all for coming tonight too. So it's really interesting hearing you describe the history of your organization, and I have to say that I was really impressed when I heard about the organization, because I too was active in Central America issues, opposing U.S. policy in Central America in the 1980s. And most of the organizations that I worked with, both on the West Coast and on the East Coast, kind of fizzled out in the 1990s. And it's really impressive to see an organization that has been able to evolve with the times and stay active and has the capacity to fill a room like this. So that's wonderful. And it was also just interesting hearing you, because you sort of described my own trajectory in the 1980s, focusing on Central America, in the 1990s on Haiti and Cuba, and in the 2000s moving to focus on U.S. policy towards Colombia, also in a kind of in a sense, a reactionary way, like where is the United States doing the most harm? That's what I need to know about, and that's what I need to teach people about. But in the last couple of decades, I also have become more and more concerned with the issue of immigration. So what I want to talk about tonight is undocumented, how immigration became illegal. And I want to start with some of the sort of catchphrases that we hear over and over again when we talk about immigration. Phrases, did my microphone go off? Hello? Okay. I didn't push the button though. Okay. It's red. I hope that doesn't mean the battery's about to die.
No, means it's on.
Just means it's on?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so.
No, the battery is dying.
Is it?
Yeah, it's gone again. Well, I'm just going to keep talking. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try to keep talking loud. So this argument that we hear all the time, well, this is a country of immigrants. We've always welcomed immigrants. This is an argument that I think is made with the argument that is made in order to convince people that we should welcome immigrants today, that we should not impose harsh and punitive and cruel policies against immigrants. So I agree with that sentiment, and yet I think that unless we understand what's behind it, it remains very superficial. And I think it's important for us to understand that, in fact, we are a country that has always welcomed immigrants as long as we were a country that could define immigrants as white people. We are a country that has only welcomed immigrants through various different legal means of allowing only white people to be members of the country. Oh, now I can stop shouting. And when, for various reasons that I'm going to talk about, the social context changed and the laws changed so that we could not allow only white people to belong to the country, then we stopped welcoming immigrants who were not white. That is, we have never been a country that has welcomed immigrants who were people of color. And I think that bringing race centrally into the conversation when we think about what actually is our history as a so-called country of immigrants is really important. So I'm going to start out now by going over what I call the master narrative. We historians like to talk about the master narrative. The master narrative is the story of history that we were all taught if we went to school here, even if we didn't go to school here. We kind of absorbed it through our pores, through the popular media, through hearing phrases like we're a country that's always welcomed immigrants. Anybody who's spent any time in this country has absorbed the master narrative to one extent or another. And when we call it the master narrative, we are asking us to think critically about what are these assumptions that have been sort of drilled into our head that we've never been asked to think about. So what I want to do today is go over the master narrative of our history as a country of immigrants in a way that I may even exaggerate it a little bit, because my point is to get us to think critically about it. But I'm not going to exaggerate it much, because, I mean, I teach freshmen every single year, and I know what they think about our history as a country of immigrants, because they come into my classroom and they tell me. So in order to give you a hint as to what I think is wrong with this master narrative, and when I finish it, we're going to talk about what's wrong with it, or maybe even while we're going through it, I give you 3 areas that I want to ask us to think about that require us to rewrite the master narrative and to understand what's wrong with it. And those 3 areas are race, geography, and labor. So let's go over really quickly this master narrative. And I have to say that even being trained as a Latin Americanist and working in Latin America Solidarity for all those years, when I started teaching U.S. immigration history, this is exactly how I taught it, because that's how it's written, and that's how I learned it, and so that was the only way I knew to teach it. So I'm being self-critical here too when I go over this master narrative. So the master narrative says there were various different phases of U.S. immigration history. First, there were the old immigrants. The old immigrants, and these are terms that are used by historians of immigration. The old immigrants shared certain characteristics. They were English, they spoke English, they came from England. This time period of the old immigrants is about, say, 1620 to 1820 or so about 200 years of the old immigration. They were, we don't have to say it, but implicitly we mean it, they were white. They were Anglo-Saxon Protestant, Protestant by religion, and they came to seeking religious freedom, perhaps, and they came because they came in family groups, and they settled in little villages where they were, so moving on to the labor part of it, they were basically self-sufficient. That is, they farmed, they made soap, they made shoes for their horses, they had a blacksmith, and they basically produced what they consumed. They came over in family groups, so the men and women came and they had children and they reproduced and they created these institutions like town meetings, and so everybody's heard that story of the old immigration, right? Okay, so then after this starts the second period of immigration, which immigration historians call the new immigration. And because immigration historians started putting together this history in the 1940s or so, it was still seemed kind of new. Like now we have things happening after the new immigration, but we still use that terminology. So the new immigrants were different from the old immigrants in several ways. They start coming around the middle of the 19th century. Instead of being English-speaking, instead of being from England, they came from the peripheries of Europe. They came from Ireland, they came from Italy, from Russia, from Poland, from Greece. Not the centers of Europe, but the peripheries of Europe, especially southern and eastern Europe. This is about 100 years of this new immigration, say 1820s, maybe 1850s, through the 1920s. They were not Protestant, but rather they were Catholic, they were Jewish, they were Orthodox. They belonged to other non-Protestant religions. They were not English-speaking because they spoke all this cacophony of languages from whatever parts of Europe they came from. And instead of coming in families to settle in farms and produce everything that they consumed, they tended to come as young single people, especially men, to work in factories. They came during the Industrial Revolution, and one of the reasons that they came was this huge demand for labor by the industrializing areas of the United States. So is everybody familiar a little bit, a tiny bit with that? And this is really the period that when people like Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama say, we're a country that has always welcomed immigrants, this is the period that they're talking about. And they talk about Ellis Island, they talk about the Statue of Liberty, they talk about give us the poem by Emma Lazarus, give us your tired, your poor, your humbled masses yearning to breathe free, right? Everybody kind of, this is there in the master narrative in your head somehow. Okay, and then comes the period which we see as an aberration in US immigration history, a period of immigration restriction that starts 1921, 1924, when the US government says, this is getting to be too much, we want to cut it down, we want to recover our Anglo-Saxon roots, and we want to put quotas on immigration, especially to stop this immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. So this is the period that's seen as an aberration in US immigration history when those golden doors kind of closed, and the numbers of people allowed in from places like Italy and Poland that had been sending large numbers of immigrants until then are cut way down. The period of immigration restriction is from 1924 until 1965. In 1965, we get a new immigration law that returns us to our real selves of welcoming immigrants. We get rid of those racial quotas. Now we're going to let everybody come in again and welcome everybody. I see some skeptical looks in the audience, but that is the master narrative of immigration. So, what's wrong with this from the perspective of race?
We're leaving out the fact that this country was Native American to begin with, and the impact of colonialism on
of being a country of immigrants, and this whole history of immigration leaves out the native population of America. Very good, important point. Yes?
Well, also, you could say slavery is immigration, and there you definitely, they're not white and they're not Anglo-Saxon and they didn't come from England.
Okay.
And that happened during pretty much that entire time period.
So one could say that slavery is immigration, but immigration historians do not count slavery as immigration. That's not what they're looking at when they look at immigration. Immigrants are people who are coming here to become citizens. Immigrants are people who are coming here to become citizens. So enslaved Africans are just written out of this history because they are not immigrants, according to immigration historians. Yes?
I have not heard you use the term indentured servants, which was your opinion. And I think.
Well, I think indentured servants, European indentured servants, are incorporated into the narrative. They fit right in.
But in those things that I have looked at, the real piece in terms of what they had to do is not exposed.
But what indentured servants have in common with the narrative is that they are able to become citizens. That is the story of immigration, is people who are going to be citizens.
Leaves out the Mexican War and how we just took California and Texas.
Yeah.
Okay, it leaves out Mexicans. That is, we define the new immigrants as people who are coming from Europe. Now, so I'm going to get to the story of Mexicans, but very good pointing it out, because what we're doing right now is talk about what's wrong with this master narrative. One more, and then I'm going to keep going.
Kind of going along with that was the fact that the only people that were considered immigrants were the non-English Europeans, because even though the migration kept happening in the southern border, and the reason why they were considered immigrants was because they weren't allowed to be citizens at the time. So we had a social construction that immigrants were only associated to white identity and not to people of color.
Okay, so hidden underneath this master narrative is the assumption, it kind of goes unstated, but it's central, that immigrants are white people who are going to become citizens. Okay. Geography, anybody want to say what's wrong with this master narrative from the perspective of geography? Somebody kind of mentioned it already over here, whoever made the comment before. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess elaborating on that, it doesn't include any of our acquisitions. Like during that time, starting in the 1600s, well, mainly the 1800s, we acquired the rest of the country. Like everything we know.
Okay, so this master narrative tells the story of the United States as if it were the story of the northeastern portion of the United States. It leaves out the entire rest of the area of the United States. Yes?
And it also doesn't touch on forced migration, the whole history of Puerto Rico, the Spanish American War. Our history, we fall in the crack.
Okay. One more in the back, and then I'm going to keep going because I see my time is racing away from me.
So what about the Danish who were there in New York?
The Danish?
Yes.
They are part of white European immigration, definitely.
But they're not English. They're not.
That's true. That is, they're kind of a crossover between the old immigrants and the new immigrants. Okay. So labor. We've sort of talked about some of the things that are wrong with this from the perspective of labor to begin with already. That is, if we look at labor being in terms of self-sufficient small farmers, then we're leaving out the labor of Africans who are brought to the United States, to America. And if we look at labor as being factory workers in the Northeast, that is, this is related to geography, there's one more large group of laborers who came into the United States that we left out. We talked about Mexicans, yes? Chinese. Okay, so geography and labor and race are all intertwined in what's wrong with the story, because the Chinese and the Mexicans do not come to Ellis Island. They come across the border from the south, or they come across the Pacific from the west, and they do not work in the factories of the Northeast. They work in mines, they work on railroads, they work in agriculture in the west and southwestern portion of the country during this period of the new immigration. So, okay, I'm returning to the Declaration of Independence because I want to emphasize the extent to which defining the country as a country of immigrants was a way of defining the country as a white country. So that the welcoming of immigrants was a way of a method of racial replacement of existing populations with white European immigrants. So if we want to say we are a country of immigrants, there's an element of truth in that, but it's not necessarily something we should be proud of, because we are a country that has fostered immigration in order to accomplish racial whitening. So what I want to look at here is some new work on the American Revolution that has emphasized the extent to which the dispute between the colonists and the crown was based on the crown's attempts to protect the rights of Native Americans and the colonists' desire to take more land and to bring in more immigrants. That is, one of the things that the crown was doing was restricting immigration of English people in order to honor treaties with Native Americans and protect Native American lands. The colonists wanted more immigration, more white immigration, as part of their project of racial replacement and land grabs. And I'm not just making this up, and this is why I give you a couple of quotes from the Declaration of Independence that show the extent to which this was a central issue. So the colonists, now the founders of the new country, talk about the crimes of the King of Great Britain, the repeated injuries and usurpations, the tyranny, and then they list the facts, the things that the king has done that are so terrible that they require independence. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners. Foreigners are white English people, and the King of England was trying to restrict immigration, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising new conditions of the appropriations of lands. That is, immigration and the taking of native land were inevitably part of the same process. And because the British Crown was trying to limit that process, that was one of the goals of the American Revolution, one of the causes of the American Revolution. Everybody following me here?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to be skipping over some things. I'm going to skip that. So, once the new country is founded, Congress makes it really clear that citizenship is based entirely 100% on race. It doesn't matter if you're an immigrant or a native born. It only matters that you be white. There's no prejudice against immigrants. Because immigrants are defined as white people, immigrants are the privileged group in the country. And this is explained in the first Naturalization Act passed by the Congress in 1790, Be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that any alien being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen thereof. Okay? If you're Native American, you cannot become a citizen. If you're African American, you may be free, but you cannot be a citizen. You also may not be free. But even if you are free, you may not be a citizen. Only if you are white can you be a citizen, and if you are white, you can automatically be a citizen. That is, all you have to do is be here for 2 years, and you're automatically a citizen if you are white. So there's no restrictions on immigration, there's no prejudice against immigrants. The restrictions are on citizenship. That's why I call this slide legislating citizenship. So as long as citizenship is legislated this way, there are no restrictions on immigration. Now this changes after the Civil War with the 14th Amendment. So this is the first 100 years of the country's life. But after the Civil War, it changes. And it changes with the 14th Amendment that creates something radically new called citizenship by birth. Citizenship by birth opens up citizenship so that it does not only belong to white people, it belongs to almost everybody born in the United States. So let me just read this. All persons, that word all sounds like it means all, right? But it doesn't really. All persons born or naturalized in the United States, and here's where the qualification comes, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Who is not subject to the jurisdiction thereof? Native Americans. Yes, so it says all, but it doesn't really mean all. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now, this amendment was passed in the aftermath of the Civil War, and it was aimed at redressing the wrongs of enslavement, of the slave system, and giving citizenship to people of African descent. Congress did not have in mind anybody else when it passed this law. And we know that because of the Naturalization Act that was passed 2 years later, which opens naturalization to aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent, but nobody else. So now there are two kinds of people who can naturalize. There's white people, and there's aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent. But think about this for a minute. 1870. How many people from Africa are migrating to the United States in 1870 to take advantage of this new naturalization law? None. But there are other people migrating to the United States in 1870 who are neither white persons or aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent. And we've already talked about them. Large numbers of people from Mexico and large numbers of people from China. They are not addressed in this law. They're not eligible for citizenship because they're neither white nor of African descent, but they're eligible for citizenship by birth. So now Congress has a dilemma. They've created a logical impossibility. People who are ineligible, racially ineligible to citizenship, which is the phrase that they use, that is, anybody who's not either white or of African descent is racially ineligible to citizenship in 1870, but if they have children here, those children, while being racially ineligible to citizenship, will also be citizens. That's not possible, right? So what does Congress do? This is when Congress starts legislating immigration, restricting immigration, in order to confront that logical impossibility, in order to maintain immigration as a racial whitening process, to make sure that non-white people are not going to migrate to the United States and take advantage of citizenship by birth. So, In between my immigration restrictions here, I point out a couple of other things that are happening. The 1862 Homestead Act and the 1887 Dawes Act. Does anybody know what these are? So the Homestead Act opens up land in the Midwest and in the West to anybody who's white who wants to take it. The Dawes Act of 1887 breaks up Native American reservations and throws them out on the free market. So the Dawes Act and the Homestead Act are kind of two sides of the same coin, opening up land for white immigrants. And we know it's only for white immigrants because we already know that there are no immigrants coming from Africa, and we start to have progressive restrictions on all immigrants who are not white. The very first one that I don't even put on here was passed in 1873, only 5 years after citizenship by birth was enacted. And it was a restriction preventing Chinese women from coming to the United States. Congress wasn't thinking very fast, so they thought, well, if we want to prevent Chinese babies from being born in the United States, we'll just stop Chinese women from coming in. We still need Chinese labor, so we'll let the men come, but they can't have babies if there's no women here. Well, a couple of years after that, they've seen that all kinds of terrible things are happening from the perspective of Congress, and all these babies who aren't white are happening. So they exclude Chinese altogether in 1882. After the Chinese Exclusion Act, subsequent exclusion acts are passed until by 1917, the Asiatic Barred Zone is declared. The Asiatic Barred Zone, I should have a map here, but that encompasses about half of the world's population, are defined as Asian, therefore racially ineligible to citizenship, therefore not allowed to enter the United States, so as to make sure they don't have babies in the United States. After 1917, anti-immigrant sentiment continues to grow, with this sense not only that the white population is threatened, but that the Anglo-Saxon nature of the country is being threatened, so that in 1921 and 1924, even European immigration is restricted. But these restrictions on Southern and Eastern European immigration, those are the ones we usually learn about, but they're just the what is it? Not the straw that breaks the camel's back, but the tip of the iceberg of all of these immigration restrictions that have been put into place. But it's true that in 1921 and 1924, Europeans, Southern and Eastern Europeans, are restricted. They're not prohibited from entering the United States as so-called Asians are, but their immigration is restricted. The numbers are there are numerical quotas put on it, and they're low numerical quotas. So at the bottom I sort of summarize all of this, what happens by 1924. European countries get quotas. Asia is defined as 3/4 of the planet's territory, and Asians are deemed to be aliens eligible to citizenship, thus not able to immigrate. And Mexicans are not restricted. There are reasons why Mexicans are not restricted, especially after restrictions on Asian migration come in. That is because Mexican labor is so necessary. So Congress deals with Mexicans in a completely different way. In the last sentence here, Mexicans could continue to cross the border freely, but they could be deported just as freely. That is, Mexicans are incorporated into the United States as deportable workers, not as immigrants. They continue to be racially ineligible to citizenship, most of them, but the way Congress decides to prevent Mexicans from having babies is to deport them. So here I go through a different chronology, one of the legal treatment of Mexicans. 1848, the decision to take as much land as possible with as few people as possible, for that very reason that Mexicans are not wanted as citizens of the United States. They are only wanted as workers, thus they are not considered immigrants. They are considered deportable workers. We have this formalized in two different periods, in 1917 to 22 and 1942 to 64, with the bracero programs, guest worker programs, that set up legal mechanisms to recruit, import, and deport Mexican workers. And then we have the informal system that goes alongside this formal system of employer recruitment and state deportation in the 1930s, and I left out the one in the 1950s, Operation Wetback. So Mexicans are considered wetbacks, they are considered deportable workers. It doesn't matter what their legal status is. What matters is that they're Mexican. When Mexicans are deported, nobody's trying to figure out if they have documentation or no documentation. There's no restrictions on Mexicans crossing the border. It's just that they are inherently and inevitably deportable for being Mexican. So when you look at the deportations of the 1930s and the 1950s, they're not based on our contemporary notion of illegality. Oh, they're being deported because they're illegal. No, they're simply being deported because they are Mexicans. This is the case until 1965. In 1965, we have our new Immigration Act, the Hart-Celler Act, which is essentially what still governs our immigration quota system. The differential quotas that had been put into place throughout the 20th century are replaced with what they call a system of uniform quotas. A system that allows anybody in the world, any country in the world, to qualify as immigrants, but only small numbers of them. So now, Asians can be considered immigrants. They can come into the United States as immigrants and obtain citizenship. The racial restrictions on immigration, on citizenship, are dismantled by 1965. Mexicans too. Every country is given a quota, although remember that much of Africa is still colonized at the time, so they don't get quotas, but we don't have to talk about that. And when African countries gain independence, they also gain quotas, so every country gets a quota. But notice that up until 1965, about 400,000 Mexicans were coming in per year as workers to be deported. This is ended in 1965, and suddenly there's this cap of 20,000 per year put on Mexicans entering the United States. Now they can be considered immigrants, but only 20,000 a year can come. So what happens to all of those workers who've been crossing the border every year? What happens to all of those employers who have relied on those workers? The system continues just under a new name. And now the name is illegality. The workers continue to come in, but now they are illegal. And now, in this open civil rights atmosphere of the 1960s, we don't discriminate, we don't deport people just for being Mexican anymore. We deport the same people because we have now created this new legal category for them, calling them illegal, so we continue to deport them just under another name that sounds more less racist. But the same thing is still happening. So, I finished. So that's how immigration became illegal. I would love to turn this off if anybody knows how to, because it's really hot and I know these bulbs are really. Does anyone want to come play with that and figure out how to turn it off while I continue to talk?
So,
Come on, somebody come up and turn this thing off for me.
Okay.
there's a button.
I know, but I'm trying to
So when we take care of that,